And of course, that makes it also daunting from my point of view, too. When I start doing an artist talk, I'm not real fond of artist talks, first off, but when I start doing an artist talk, I'm always thinking about, where do I start? How do I put all of this experience into 10, 15, 20 minutes of discussion? Because I've realized over the years, as I've been doing my work, that, and I talked to Liz a little bit about this at the opening, the myriad of influences that come into work when you span years of production. She's got snippets of that information that she's put into some of the writings about the work. But no matter how many influences I talk about, there are hundreds and hundreds of other people that have influenced my work that don't come out. And I was thinking the other day about working methods, and some of the reviews that have been done of my work, they talk about Jasper Johns as being an influence, and some of the attachments that are on the paintings kind of relate to that. But I was thinking how that's true. But one of strong memories I have from art history was an Arthur Dove painting called Goin' Fishin'. And it's a painting that has fishing poles and line and all kinds of other stuff attached to the painting, which predates Jasper Johns' work by decades. And it's just kind of interesting that those influences become so vast that it's really hard to narrow it down to a few things to talk about. And of course, life experiences too are a part of that. I grew up in a totally different part of the country. This Maryland is where I've settled, but I grew up out west. And in my early years, my father was real estate developing and construction. And I got the fun job of starting out at about 13 years old, cleaning out houses. And I worked my way through basically building houses from the ground up, foundation work with concrete, studs, framing, roofing, everything, insulation. So a lot of the things that are in these paintings really come from that, my interest in construction processes, and how things fit together, the intricacies of geometry. But again, as the other experiences came about, when I went through art school, I originally started out pretty representational, dealing with landscape and that type of work, and slowly began to think about the nature of abstraction. I think one of the light bulbs that went off was when I was in high school doing my landscape paintings. I was leafing through one of those old Time Life art magazines, art books, and I ran into a painting called Bed by Robert Rauschenberg. And I said, what is going on here? It was just a challenge to everything I'd been thinking about. And slowly, through studying art history, going to lots of museums, things began to change, shift direction. And a trip to Europe, specifically a few weeks in southern Spain, going to the Alhambra and the mosque at Cordoba, and experiencing Islamic design made a drastic change in my thinking too. So a lot of these pieces have echoes of that as well. And of course, it corresponded to a large degree with what was happening in the art world at that point in time. Conceptual art was happening, Soloist, artists that worked with systems. So all of those things clicked at that point in time, and ended up coming out in these works. And you'll probably notice as you go through the exhibition that I tend to work serially. I tend to find a few themes and just repeat them. This series of paintings, called the 3/4 series, because of the 3/4 inch wood that is used as the frame. This series started in 97, so it's a long-running series of paintings that I'm just exploring the nature of a real simple structure of this 3/4 inch frame with the concentric circles and a cruciform and some other subdivisions in it, just kind of exploring all of the possibilities of shape that I can derive from that really narrow group of shapes. And And it started out black and white, mostly just neutrals, and it slowly evolved into color. So it kind of expanded that direction as I've gone along. So that's kind of a synopsis of some of the things that have happened. But printmaking was also a big factor. When I was in high school, I was told that you had to be a graphic designer to make a living as a painter or as an artist. And I figured out rapidly that wasn't for me. And when I went to school for art at Colorado State University is where I did undergraduate work. And they had a big art department, real interesting, but the painting department didn't hit me as very interesting. And I took a class in printmaking. And my interest in drawing probably made the connection to printmaking even stronger. But they had two guys that were Lasansky printmakers from Iowa, sort of classic printmakers. And they were both really involved in the whole process of dealing with prints and pushed everybody. And the energy in the classroom there was abundant. Unlike the painting department at that point in time, if you went into the printmaking department any time, day or night, any day, there was always somebody in there and more than one person working. So it was just an energy that was vast. So I really gravitated to printmaking. And of course, that's probably where some of the ideas of my sort of serial nature of dealing with works came about. Because printmaking gives you the option of doing so much with that process. And you know, in some of these prints, it shows up. And some of the ones that are in the back room back there are really great for that. But, you know, you can take an image like this. These guys are all the same plates, but just printed with different colors overlaying each other. So you can take a single image and do variations on those themes. There's another one over here, a more recent one, where I'm playing with sheen collé, and it's the same print, but I'm just doing the sheen collé, which is a collage form on print, where you take a thin piece of paper and collage it into the print as you're dealing with it. And you can see I've just taken the same print and placed that piece of paper in different places on the surface. So prints actually give you a way of working with a repetitive approach to drawing. So you don't have to draw the whole thing over again. You can kind of just take that essential image and just alter it in different ways. Print it in different colors, print it in different directions, print another image on top of it. The prints that are in the back room, there's two etchings, and both of them involve plates that are printed on top of each other. The one with the little circles, that's kind of a net of images. That was the same print. I made one plate, and then I just rotated it 180 degrees and printed it on top of itself so that it gives more density to it and changes the pattern. So prints just always gave me the opportunity of really playing with a lot of different permutations on any individual plate. And I like that to this day. In fact, it's traditionally, you know, prints have been made to be able to make hundreds of images that are the same, so you can make a inexpensive and more accessible imagery. But I rarely edition my prints. I tend to work almost exclusively with images where I'm just playing with variations of how they can be printed and what other combinations I can print with them. I have done a few editions, but most of them are like 2 or 5. And part of that comes from life experiences. Again, funny things that pop up. But when I was fresh out of undergraduate school, I worked in a foundry that produced Western art. It was really an interesting, eye-opening thing. But I worked with a lot of artists that were really serious about what they were doing. But there was a time I was a chaser, which means I would take the welds and clean them up and make the work neat so that they could go to the patina people. And I was working on this sculpture, and I noticed the edition number was like 80 or 90 pieces, something like that. And I was like, this piece is going to haunt me. I know someday I'll be in somebody's house and I'll see this piece and I'll say, I worked on that piece. and they're all over the place. So I realized that making hundreds of pieces wasn't necessarily my way of thinking too. It would haunt me. So I narrowed it down in terms of my additions. Um, the prints that are here and the ones that are in the back room, the experience of this show, I think, has really been good in that what I've wanted to pull together work that covers a broad range of years for quite a while. It's been in the back of my head, and as the older I get, I keep thinking about those things I've already mentioned. How all these influences come together to build the range of work, and the look of each work is kind of a summation of that. They pull little bits and pieces from one place, and they move through the years. So it was really great to be able to put together a show that allowed me to have some work from way back. The oldest drawings and prints back there are 1978. And they come up to these paintings, a few of these that are from last year. So it covers a pretty broad range, not anywhere near comprehensive, but it covers a broad range of the decades. And I've enjoyed that immensely, to be able to do that, because of the desire to really show how things have come together. And today, these prints that I brought, I kind of wanted to let you guys see some of the same range. These prints date, again, from back in the 70s up to some of the more recent years. And I don't know if do you want to let everybody come up and take a peek at these, or? Because they're not completely easy to see from the distance, but the works kind of go chronologically from these. These works are from the late 70s and 80s. There were times when I tended to move away from the more organic, like some of the prints back there deal with mark making a little bit more. And as I went through some of my processes, I started to focus on the geometry, which is part of what's going on in these too. Most of this series uses the same format, a square with a circular form in it, and then all of the little subdivisions. So geometry played a big role in how I built these prints. And this was at a point when I was going through that desire to have a really clean, neat look to the images, less about the mark making. Again, another influence was the artist Ad Reinhardt, who the last, I think, 15 years of his life, he painted black paintings that were just a cruciform, but they were real subtle images. And somewhere I was reading about his desire to eliminate the mark, that mark was extraneous to everything. So I went through that phase where I cleaned everything up a lot and dealt with images that were very pure, clean. These are all made with the etching process. A metal plate immersed in acid with a hard ground that is scribed, and you etch the lines into that surface. And then they were rolled with a surface roll afterwards. So I would ink it, wipe it with the black ink that would be filling in all the lines, and then I would roll a really thin layer of gray ink on top of that and run it through the press. So you get two printings essentially with one run through the press. And I cut a stencil with acetate for some of these, like this one, where you have a white area on here, so that I could mask out those areas and prevent the ink from rolling across it, to get a little control on that and then accent that shape. And these are done the same way. And as we move through this group of prints, obviously you can see I got a little bit more expressive with the mark making. This print was done actually at Grinnell College when I was there visiting and working with some of the students, and played with some leftover plates. And having been a printmaker that studied with two Lazansky printmakers, one of the things that they always emphasized was scraping out the plates I know that they told me that they had when they were in school, Lasansky would often have the people take a plate that has already been etched and everything, and then have them scrape it down before they could even start their own print. They had to remove the old image to start. So that's kind of what I did. I took 2 used plates, scraped off a large part of the old image, and then built another image over the top of it. And then the students that were there printed these prints so that they could have the fun of printing my imagery, and I gave them a copy of each of those. So there's 2 variations. Grinnell, they're called Grinnell Cross 1 and Grinnell Cross 2. So there's this sort of faint cruciform image in there, which pops up in the work a lot too. You know, the cruciform is kind of evident in a lot of these paintings too, either in sort of X or in the cross that's built in there. And that's a reference back to Reinhardt more than anything. You know, Ad Reinhardt's paintings that he did in the latter part of his life. And then there's these, which are all relief prints. That one's not, that one's a collograph. These are relief prints, and they actually came about through my constructions. I usually always have lots of leftover bits and pieces of wood and shapes that are cut out. So these were actually pieces of wood that were laying around in the studio that I'd used for some of the construction pieces. And instead of just discarding them, they weren't ultimately used in any finished piece. Instead of discarding them, I just printed them. I inked them over so that the sort of cutout areas and the saw cuts, little imperfections where they'd been stapled together, become part of the image. And then the shape is one of those familiar sort of shapes that I use frequently, this little triangular cutout. This print is an etching that I don't really have any of the paintings in here from that time frame, but I did use a trifoil shape for a series of paintings from the late 90s. And this print was one that was made about the time I was working with that. The trifoil is, again, a sort of a systematized shape. It has, obviously, there's some religious connections to it too, in terms of use in church decoration, but it's just essentially 3 circles that are tied together by an equilateral triangle in the print. And so they have a center point that connects the circles together. I don't think I have any of my constructions that work off that, but there are some that, no, none of those are that. This is another print process that is really fun. It's a really easy print process. It's called collograph. It was, I think, mostly attributed to a printmaker on the West Coast, Glen Alps. And it's essentially a collage process where you take bits and pieces of other material and collage it onto a piece of mat board, is what I usually use, but a lot of different substrates can be used. But just a piece of mat board, and then there's cloth and strips of paper that are glued down, and then you ink it and wipe it in an intaglio method, which means you're pushing it into all the little nooks and crannies and wiping off the highlighted sections and printing it. It's real direct. It gets the beauty of being able to cut and shape that, because it's a real easy type of plate to shape. And you get really interesting textural effects from that. Then these are some more recent etchings that were done with the etching process using nitric acid. This is an aqua tint, and that's an aqua tint where just a fine grained powder is applied, and it gives you that sort of sandpaper texture that prints really rich blacks on this, and this one was scraped down quite a bit. So these are all kind of in that same series that relates to the paintings that are here too, these little dots and stripes that are laid out on this set of paintings. But they incorporate more mark-making processes and exploration of like the sheen collé. So do you guys have any questions about any of this?
Are you able to make prints in your current studio, or do you need to go to another facility?
I am. The studio, was lucky enough, we put together, when we shifted from moving out of the city, we constructed a studio at our house. So I have a nice place out there, and we built up a back porch on that. So my printmaking efforts are always seasonal, because you can acquire the mordants and acids pretty readily. So I do my etching during the summer outside on the back covered patio. And I work primarily on zinc plate. So that's really easy, and you can use nitric for that, which is real easy to come by. So the etching is all done on the patio, and then I have a small little Conrad press. My press is really tiny. It's only about 12-inch wide by 30-inch press bed. But as you can see, I don't work really large anyway, so it gives me the opportunity to print as much as I want. And during the summer, that's usually my activity.
Nitrate sounds kind of dangerous.
Nitric? It is, but I've been using it since undergraduate. We used zinc plates in my undergraduate school because it was cheaper metal to work on than copper. Copper is much pricier. It's got a beautiful surface and has some nice qualities, but zinc was so easy. So we always used nitric, and I kind of just gotten the practice of working with it. Yeah, just real careful, and it's diluted quite a bit. The nitric solutions that I use for etching is usually about anywhere from 6:1 to 12:1, meaning full strength nitric acid diluted with 6 parts water. So it's not super. You can put your fingers in it. I do all the time, and you only time you notice it is if you have a cut or something. Then you notice it right away. Yeah, it stings. It really does sting. But so you kind of watch that. That use the hand that doesn't have any cuts on it.
Or wear gloves.
Or wear gloves. Yeah, I've never done that though. I always just like the tactile feel, and sometimes I think it's actually safer because gloves potential to slip or something. With putting your hand in the acid, you grab it firmly.
You used to all your fingerprints.
I do. The only time I lost my fingerprints was when I was doing a lot of photography and was sticking my hand in the developers and stuff. Then I had trouble that way, but the fingerprints are still handy, still there. Any other interests, thoughts?
Vaughn, could you talk a little bit more about some of the continuity of those motifs that we see here? Because they appear in almost all aspects of the work, and you touched on it a little bit. I'm thinking specifically about your little circular ovular pieces.
Right. There's a lot of connectivity as we go through, and there's actually reactions. As I said, the real clean prints were kind of a reaction to those prints that are in the back where I was getting really super involved with mark making, like the drawings that are the tiny little circles that were done. Those came in 77, 78, and I reached a point where I was just kind of overwhelmed with that process of making those little marks and cleaned it up going this direction. But those little circular forms and scribbles, parallel lines that are ruled, those are things that are just kind of the vocabulary of marks that I've always liked and always used. So you can see, like in the back of this print, there's a bunch of scribbles, and there's also these ruled lines, and then there's the little circular forms on the side. They're a little more organic, but that combination of mark is something that just resurfaces, and it's almost, hopefully not a habit, but kind of a vocabulary that has come about through the prints. And I tend to kind of react to different aspects of the drawings. Like I was saying, those little circular drawings that I was doing, I reached a point where I was just saturated with them and became overly conscious about them, and then kind of pushed them out of the way for a while. But they were resurfacing in different forms. And they started resurfacing in these type of marks, but they always bothered me in the paintings and in some of the prints I was doing. They had that sort of leopard-like quality that really bugged me. So I was trying to avoid going back to those little circular marks, but at the same time not happy with their evolution to these little dots that as I said, look too much like leopard-type spots. So this series of paintings actually is kind of an evolution of that, where you can see I was experimenting with different ways of putting those marks together. There's some that are really big circles, and they kept getting smaller and smaller until I got back to a size that was similar to what's in those drawings. And ultimately, they work better. You sometimes resist the things that maybe are the best best solution, but for whatever reason, artists do a lot of that. I think either rationalize their choices or don't see the choices that make the most sense.
How much of this comes from a direct idea as opposed to improvising as you go?
That's a good question. I always have found a sort of a schizophrenic quality to how I work, because I'm very rational on one side, trying to deal with systematic approach to things. Yet I also like the improvisational, just chance and that type of aspect. And I've always been battling with trying to make sense of them together, so that they would work as a coherent idea. And I remember having discussions with one of my professors about that, and we talked about the being carefully careless, that whole idea of how artists, and Robert Rauschenberg, again, bring his name up, he did two paintings called Factum 1 and Factum 2, which were kind of neo-abstract expressionist paintings that were duplicates of each other. And he was essentially making the point that artists that appear to be very spontaneous can also be very, very conscious of what they're doing, and it can be a very thought out process as opposed to just being, visceral. So that sort of balancing act has always been in the back of my mind, trying to figure it out. And I do like chant as part of the things that happen. So there are aspects of things that I do that are related to that, trying to inject a little bit of chance into the pieces. I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but
I think that relationship between what you characterized as schizophrenic, which I don't think is schizophrenic,
no,
and your intention really creates the syntax of all of your work.
Yeah.
And because in every work that I've seen a lot of it in your studio here, there's this movement towards balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you really make that happen throughout the work, whether it's the improvisational mark or the very constructed plan on working through in this series or that series, and
right.
Those modifications that really provides that structure to the language of the work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I see it sometimes as kind of schizophrenic, but it is just that division between different ways of thinking and different ways of making a solution to something. And I've been fascinated with how different artists approach that too. I remember in graduate school, I was at MoMA looking at some of Duchamp's work, and he has a piece called 3 Standard Stoppages. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it's essentially a piece that he was playing a game with the standardization of 1 meter. So he took a meter-long piece of thread, and it's supposed to be tailor's thread, and held it at 1 meter and dropped it onto a piece of cloth. And then the form that it fell into, he glued it down, and he made these 3 standard stoppages, which are essentially, he's playing games with the idea of the scientific process and the meter. Well, being the analytical person that I tend to be at times, I decided to try that. So I got thread, cut it into a meter, held it a meter over a piece of cloth and dropped it, and it never fell into this gentle curve like he had. Never. I could not duplicate it at all. And he said he did it 3 times only, and it fell into this curve. Each one of the curves was unique, but it said he only did it 3 times. I read an interview with an art critic, So I immediately realized that he was playing a major joke with everybody. He was, completely kind of toying with the idea of chance and making a joke about the whole process. So that was part of another aside of my thinking process. That
Well, that's what I love about your work, is that you are so mindful about everything you do, but not so controlled. I love how you look at Duchamp and, of course, Stephen Horn and, Rauschenberg, but you're not derivative. It's not derivative at all. There's just something very special. Well,
thank you.
I'm kind of not the most unbiased, but I just love your work. I love the fact that, a lot of us can see the form and how beautiful the form is, but we may not be able to see how to put those forms together. And you just stop and you think, and just like Bob Ross, where those happy accidents are.
That's true.
How to invest in those happy accidents,
Mm-hmm.
but you're just incredibly mindful about them. And I don't think it's overthought at all. I think mindfulness is the most gentle, kindest word to use for your work, because it's not derived and it's not so intentional and thought out. And I don't know.
Thank you. The whole idea of artist's originality is kind of one of those things that I've thought about over and over and over for years. And I've actually made the realization that the idea of a masterpiece, is kind of a construct that's come about through art history and different ideas about that sort of flash of inspiration that is important. But I've actually realized the connection that all artists have to each other, that it's actually almost a communal process in a way, that even though my work, I strive not to be derivative, not to be too much, but the influence, I can always see them. I know where the influences came from, and I know I've been vastly influenced by so many different artists. But at the same time, there's something positive about that connectivity to the history of art. I always tell my drawing classes when I'm teaching about when they pick up a piece of charcoal and start drawing, they are connecting to those artists that were drawing on the cave walls 30, 40,000 years ago. It's just that basic process that is so basic, but so human, that it connects all of the artists from that point on. Those little painted hands on cave walls where they spray paint around them always bring to mind Jasper Johns, and it's just, there's something beautiful about that connectivity. And we tend to, I think in the art world, sometimes there's almost too much emphasis placed on the individual, about, that masterpiece and coming up with ideas that nobody else has ever done, which is not really realistic in some respects.
Well, I love that you will also look at artists. You're very, to be open and to be studying your craft and, learning from others. I think it's great. And, there were some artists who don't want to admit that they were looking at somebody.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I think that's unfortunate, but yeah, I think I've known people that were very fearful about being compared to somebody.
Well, bravo.
Thank you.
So of all the mediums that you work at, do you have one that you love more than another?
That's a good question. I don't. I'm always playing with new things. And as I said, a lot of things come back to those days when I was working, building houses, finding bits and pieces of materials like, cast off things like washers. This piece was made with recycled lead sheets that I picked up at a plumbing supply, and they roll it out into big sheets, and then I could cut it and shape it as I wanted, and make sure I wash my hands afterwards. And so there's that material. The tar on this piece was printmaking asphaltum that I just kind of poured into that space to kind of coat that surface. And so I'm always finding bits and pieces of materials that I like. I've worked a lot with concrete, casting concrete, which came about from the days I was working in construction and learned that I really didn't want to do that for a living, for making foundations and footings, but the concrete's okay. So there's not a material that I love more than others. I tend to jump back and forth. Even within the painting, I work with acrylics. That large painting is acrylic on canvas. These are all oil on wood. And I've painted with gouache, watercolor, just all the different paint materials. When I was a graduate student, I had a show up that was kind of ranging like this. I had a lot of different things going on in it. I had some ceramic constructions, and the chairman of the department said, your work's kind of all over the place. Are you sure this is, cohesive enough? And it made me think about that. But what I told him was that it's a way I figure out how to keep moving. Because when I get stuck with something, like if I'm moving forward with an oil painting, and I find myself, what am I going to do? I don't know what's the next step. I jump to something like this, or I go to a print, and those things help me get out of that impasse. So it kind of breaks through the blockage. So I tend to keep working more steadily that way, because I don't get stuck and sit down and ponder it for a month or so. So that's kind of my method.
It's much more mercurial, and cyclical, coming back and, like the planet moving around and doing these loops and odd turns to come back to something. There was a conversation earlier about originality or something, and I think it's hard for an artist to work in like one mode. Like, I've done this thing and I'm just going to keep doing that thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I feel like that's actually a constraint that a lot of people put on themselves. It's very difficult for an artist.
Yeah, I think so. Working in different materials just is a way of breaking out of that, I think. And for me, it's always worked really well. And I think looking at the work, as you guys are taking it in, I think you can probably see the connections from a lot of these to the works that are done in prints to paintings and even to these little guys. So it's just a real freeing thing for me. I just find it easy to keep jumping back and forth.
Do you find that working on the smaller format with the printmaking more difficult to go back and forth from these larger paintings? And suddenly there's this space right here versus this space here.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That the scale is always really a factor in terms of how you work. I remember I was taking photographs for an artist, local artist, and their little teeny pieces were just these glorious little pieces, but as they got a little bigger, you could see the struggle happening in there. And I think it's sometimes really difficult to go from small scale to big size and to make those marks work. They change,
Especially if you're wanting to go back and forth, if you're stopping here for a reason and then
Yes.
going on to something else.
Yeah, I think it could be an issue, but I think I've been doing it for so long that I've kind of got used to it in some respects. So it doesn't usually prevent me from jumping from small scale to large scale. I've always found that there are some sizes that just work well for me.
Right.
I've tried some pretty big paintings before, and I've just never liked the end results. I'm sorry?
Human scale.
Actually, yeah, some like 6. I have.
That's what I feel these are.
Those are pretty good size, but I've actually done bigger ones. 6 by 6 feet, 6 by 8 feet, And those have usually never had quite the same feel to them. So those are ones that I usually disassemble and cannibalize them for other things. And I do that a lot. I cannibalize things all the time. But
Have you ever wanted to try a larger format with your printmaking, or have you done that?
I actually have done that, yeah. Having gone to school with two guys that were with Lazansky always made gigantic etchings. So when I was in undergraduate, I did prints that were a full sheet of zinc, which is 24 by 36 inches. So I did a large number of prints that were that big. We had a press bed on one of our motorized presses that you could print. The press bed was 48 by 72 inches on the press. So you could print huge prints if you wanted to. And they always encouraged us to do that. Our acid trays were big enough to fit a whole sheet of zinc into it. So 24 by 36. So I did a lot of big prints. I still have a few hanging out in my flat files, but I realized that the scale didn't work as well as some of these sizes. And I think one of the shocks I had to make, actually thinking about scale, was I ran into an exhibition at the Hirshhorn. No, not the Hirshhorn. It was at the Whitney in the 80s. And it was a painter named Myron Stout. I don't know if any of you guys know Myron Stout. He was an abstract expressionist painter, but he didn't paint much larger than this size. And there's just this beautiful exhibition of his small abstract expressionist paintings. And I realized, wow, this could still work even in a smaller scale. You know, you don't have to have that monumental scale that was so much the rage with the abstract expressionists, and it was almost mandatory that you go that huge scale. So, you know, that kind of made me start thinking about scaling down, working smaller size. Sure.
Yeah, you make it work across the spectrum. You're not a one-trick pony.
Now, see if I can continue that. That's the trick. It's an ongoing process, and as I've gotten older, it's kind of rethinking a lot of things. I tended to be really productive, through the 30 when I was in my 30s, 40s. I was always producing, lots and lots of work. I have so many flat files full of stuff, but as I've got older, I started to rethink that process too, about how much do I need to produce? How much should I be producing? And I found myself narrowing down and recycling things a lot more, taking things that I don't like and revisiting them. And that's the beauty of how I work too. A lot of, little pieces like this can be taken and assembled into something else. The big paintings like those guys that is on that wall, I've disassembled some of those and reused bits and pieces. In fact, this piece is actually a recycled one. It never worked very well, and it had a large connection, a box that came out here, and some other bits and pieces, and some of those pie shapes were attached to it. Just never liked it, so I kind of took it and reassembled it, reworked it. So, my ode to recycling.